Hey everybody, welcome back to the Least of These podcast. My name is Janai Jackson. All right, so in our last episode, I explored a question that Michael Knowles posed to Reed Choi, namely, is the Book of James a solid defense of Protestantism? And in that video, we saw how both gentlemen answered that question in the negative. Now, I understand why Michael Knowles would answer the question in the negative. After all, he is a well-known devout Catholic. He kind of has to answer that in that way. But I'll admit, I was a bit surprised to hear Reed Choi say no as well, especially since after doing some research, I've come to find out that he actually identifies as Protestant. But who knows? Maybe all that's changing. But either way, I thought that question was definitely worth examining and, of course, making a whole video on. And so instead of reacting to that claim again, which is what usually happens in these types of conversations, I wanted to actually slow down and actually do the work. And so in that last video, I walked through James chapter 2, verse 14 through 26 exegetically, meaning verse by verse, and I did so without leaning on Paul or appealing to other difficult passages to, somehow explain James away. And what we saw when we did that is that James chapter 2 does, in fact, offer a solid defense of Protestantism, when, of course, James is allowed to speak on his own terms. Now, if you watched that video, you know that I ended the video by briefly flipping the question. Because if James chapter 2 really does support the Protestant understanding of justification, then we also have to ask and consider the harder question, which is, does James chapter 2 actually support Catholicism or, by extension, Eastern Orthodoxy? And so that's why I want to expand on in this video. Because I don't think it's enough to say that James doesn't contradict Protestantism. I actually think if I say that James doesn't contradict Protestantism, then we also need to be able to explain very clearly and carefully why this passage actually creates serious problems for the Catholic and Orthodox frameworks of justification. And so, just like the last video, I'm not going to rely on Paul here, right? We are only going to use the categories and logic that James himself gives us in this very passage, because if James really does teach what Rome and Orthodoxy claim, then that should be able to be demonstrated from James alone. And so to avoid any accusation of straw manning, I'll be using official Catholic sources, especially from the Council of Trent, to show what Rome actually teaches. And while I know that Catholics and Orthodox differ in some areas, especially when it comes to justification, in practice, they actually end up doing the exact same thing and appealing to the exact same verses in James chapter 2. And so theoretically speaking, if James undermines one position, then he necessarily undermines the other as well. And I think there are 5 major pressure points where the Catholic and Orthodox reading simply cannot be held together in light of James chapter 2. Right? That's my position, right? And so that's what we're going to walk through in this video. Now, I'll have you know that this will not be a full exegetical breakdown. I've already done that work. I'm not going to redo all of that. That was an hour-long video. You can go back and watch that if you want to see my homework. And so really what I'm going to be doing is giving you some of the conclusions of the positions that I already took in that video. And so if you want to see my homework, go back and watch that video. All right, so with all that being said, let us get started. All right, so before we can begin reviewing the 5 pressure points that James chapter 2 places on Catholicism, and of course by extension Eastern Orthodoxy, we first need to be very, very clear about what Rome actually teaches. Because if we're going to critique a position, we need to critique the real position, not a caricature of it. Of course, we hate as Protestants when that happens to us, and so I definitely don't want to do that in the other direction. And so the best way to do that is to go directly to Rome's own authoritative sources. And so what I want to do here is just walk through 4 canons from the Council of Trent. Now, these canons are not obscure, and they are absolutely central to the Catholic position. And so together, they're going to give us a very clear picture of how Roman Catholicism understands justification. And broadly speaking, this is also the framework Eastern Orthodoxy operates within, even if they're less formal about codifying it. And so let's start with Canon 9. In Canon 9, it says this: if anyone says that the sinner is justified by faith alone, meaning that nothing else is required to cooperate in order to obtain the grace of justification, and that it is not in any way necessary that he be prepared and disposed by the action of his own will. Let him be anathema. Now, this canon is absolutely critical for this conversation because this is where Trent formally condemns justification by faith alone. And despite what some modern Catholic apologists try to argue at this point, this is not merely a condemnation of antinomianism, right? The canon is actually very explicit and very clear about what it's condemning here. Rome is rejecting the claim that faith by itself is sufficient for justification, specifically because it excludes any cooperation of the human will. That's the issue. Rome is in effect saying that faith alone, understood as faith without human cooperation, is insufficient for justification. And so anyone who holds that view is anathematized. Now, Protestants are often told, well, Trent was just condemning a caricature of sola fide. But my friends, I just need us to understand that that explanation really doesn't hold up here, because the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone explicitly teaches that faith itself is sufficient for justification, even though, of course, we clarify that faith is never alone in its effects. But Rome does not allow that distinction, right? If it did, then we wouldn't be disagreeing now, would we? Rather, Trent explicitly denies that faith by itself justifies, which as Protestants, we hold to that belief. And so that takes us directly to Canon 11, which actually says this: if anyone says that men are justified either by the sole imputation of the justice of Christ or by the sole remission of sins to the exclusion of the grace and the charity which is poured forth in their hearts by the Holy Spirit and remains in them, or even the grace by which we are justified is only by the favor of God, let him be anathema. Now, essentially, for those who don't know, what this canon is actually teaching us is that justification is not merely a declarative act of God. It is not simply God declaring a sinner righteous on the basis of faith. Rather, justification involves an internal transformation and, crucially, human cooperation. And that's really important, right? Faith may initiate a person's justification, but it does not complete it on its own. The individual must, and I do mean must, actively cooperate with grace. And so, unfortunately, this is where many of my Protestant brothers and sisters often get confused, because Protestants absolutely affirm that good works follow saving faith. We affirm obedience. We affirm transformation. But the difference is that Rome places those works inside the act of justification itself. Protestants say that works are the result of justification. Rome says works cooperate in justification. That's the difference. Now, whether you want to call that cooperation or working, the substance is actually the same. Human action plays a role in securing and sustaining one's justified status before God. And that's the problem on the table. And that becomes even clearer when we move to Canon 16, which says this: if anyone says that he will for certain, of an absolute and infallible certainty, have that great gift of perseverance unto the end, unless he shall have learned this by special revelation, let him be anathema. Now, what this canon denies is the irrevocability of justification. In other words, to put it plainly, justification is not a once-for-all legal verdict. A person can be justified at one point and then later lose that justified status through their own fault, sometime later, right? Justification, understood in the Catholic/Orthodox sense, is conditional, right? It can be forfeited. It is not permanently secure. And this is where Rome is very, very clear. You can be in a state of grace today and then fall out of that state of grace tomorrow. Your justification is something that must be maintained through your cooperation. It must be preserved. And the way it is preserved is through your continued cooperation with grace, through your obedience, through your sacramental participation, and through your good works. Now, Yes, yes, yes. I understand, and I know some Protestants also reject perseverance of the saints as well, but that disagreement only pushes them closer to Rome at this point. You see, the Protestant doctrine of justification by faith alone teaches that justification is a settled verdict precisely because saving faith is a living faith that endures to the end, right? However, Rome explicitly denies that framework. And so that brings us to the final canon, which is canon 24, which says this: if anyone says that the justice received is not persevered and also increased before God through good works, but that those works are merely the fruits and signs of justification obtained, and not the cause of its increase, let him be anathema. Now, this canon is really important because it actually removes any remaining ambiguity that someone might have at this point. Because Rome, in its effect, is teaching that justification is not only preserved by good works, which is already problematic enough, but it's actually increased by them. And so works at this point are not merely evidence of justification. They're not simply fruits or signs. No, rather, they are actively augment a person's justification status or justified status before God. And so this means that righteousness is not something you simply possess in full once justified. Rather, it is something that grows. It is something that can be strengthened. It is something that can be increased. And conversely, it is something that can be diminished or lost. And so when you put all of this together, Rome's position becomes very, very clear. Justification is not a one-time verdict. It is a process, right? Faith initiates justification. Human cooperation sustains it. Works increase it. And failure to cooperate in this whole entire system can result in losing it altogether. And again, even though Eastern Orthodoxy does not codify these claims in the same exact way that Rome does, functionally speaking, they basically affirm the exact same structure, right? Justification in both systems is cooperative. It is conditional. It is progressive. And so now that we have Rome's teaching clearly on the table, again, using Rome's own words, we are finally in a position to see why James chapter 2 creates such serious and unavoidable problems for this entire framework. And so the first point that poses such a serious problem for Rome's entire framework is actually the very first verse of this very passage. In James chapter 2, verse 14, he says this: "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him?" Now, immediately, right off the bat, we can already see why this verse is so damaging to the Roman Catholic and, by extension, Eastern Orthodox understanding of justification. Because James is not treating the person's claim to faith without works as salvific in any sense. Rather, he treats it as though it has no saving power at all. And the key word that everything hinges on here is the word that. You see, James does not ask, can faith save him, which is what Rome and Orthodoxy would need him to say. Rather, he asks, can that faith save him? And that distinction is doing an enormous amount of theological work, because James is clearly assuming that there is a kind of faith that saves. That much is not up for debate in the text. The entire question only makes sense if saving faith is already a shared assumption. And so what James is doing is distinguishing between two kinds of faith: one that saves and one that does not. And the faith that does not save is the faith that is merely claimed, that is verbally professed, that is unaccompanied by works. And this is exactly where Rome runs into trouble, because Roman Catholicism cannot allow James to be making that sort of distinction. Rome must read this verse as though James were asking, can faith alone save him? But that is simply not what James says. James is not critiquing faith as such, as a saving power in and of itself. He is critiquing a particular kind of faith. He's critiquing that faith, which is specific. And this is where a simple English analogy helps clarify what James is doing. You see, if I say that man cannot swim because he never took swimming lessons. I am not saying that no man can swim. I am saying that that man, under those conditions, cannot swim. You see, the statement only works because the category man who cannot swim already exists. And so the problem is not with swimming. The problem is with that particular man, right? And my friends, James is doing the exact same thing. He is saying that the faith of a person who claims belief but has no works, no obedience, no submission, no transformation, that faith cannot save that person. Not because faith in and of itself is insufficient in general, but because that faith is a counterfeit. And this is why James does not say that this faith is weak or immature or incomplete. Rather, in verse 17, he says that that faith is dead. My friends, dead faith is not faith that needs help. Dead faith is not faith waiting to be activated, right? Dead faith is faith, but in name only. It is no faith at all, right? This is what James is condemning. He is addressing what we would rightly call antinomian faith, which is a faith that claims Christ but refuses obedience. A faith that confesses truth but produces no submission. A faith that says all the right things while remaining fundamentally unchanged, right? Rome, however, treats this condemned faith as real but incomplete. You see, Rome has to say, well, yes, that faith is actually genuine, Janai, but it just needs cooperation to make it salvific, right? It needs works added to it. That's what James is getting at. It just needs to be completed. But James does not give them that option. He doesn't describe this faith as merely unfinished. No, he pronounces that faith dead. And that difference is not small, because the idea that a dead faith can be brought to life through human cooperation, or really it's human works, is not only theologically dangerous, but it's also a concept that James never even entertains. For James, the absence of works does not mean that faith is somehow in a dormant status. It means that that faith was never alive to begin with. And so that right there is a fundamental mismatch between James and the Roman Catholic system. James draws a hard line between saving faith and a counterfeit, or what he calls a dead faith. Roman Orthodoxy collapses that distinction. And as you'll see, once that distinction is gone, the entire framework Rome builds on James chapter 2 starts to unravel. And we can kind of see that unraveling even more clearly in the next point that James gives us, one that is absolutely devastating for the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox system of justification, because this is where James explicitly rejects the very framework Rome needs in order for his doctrine of justification to work. In verse 18, James says this, "But some will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works." Now, many people don't even realize what James has just done here, but it's absolutely massive. James has just told us that the idea that one person can have faith and another person can have works is absolutely incoherent. Faith and works are not parallel to each other. They're not independent categories that can exist side by side. They are not separable in that way. And this is absolutely crucial because Roman Catholicism, and again, Eastern Orthodoxy by extension, must treat faith and works as independent categories. In the Roman Catholic system, faith initially justifies you. And then works, or again, what they call human cooperation, must then be added to that faith in order for justification to be sustained, persevered, and even increase. And so faith does one thing while works does another thing. And together they produce justification, but James won't allow that framework to stand. James does not say you need both faith and works. That's not how this verse is, unfortunately, that's how this verse is often summarized, but that's not actually what he is saying. What James is saying is far stronger than that. He is essentially saying that one cannot exist without the other. It is incoherent, in other words, to speak of saving faith without works. And it is equally incoherent to speak of God-pleasing works without saving faith. Do you see that? And we can see this clearly in how James frames the challenge, right? He doesn't say, you have faith and I have works, so let's combine them. No, he says, show me your faith apart from your works. And his point is that this cannot be done. It is an impossible challenge. Faith is invisible by nature. We covered this in the last video. And so the only way that it can ever be shown is through what it produces, right? A simple tree analogy helps here. If you have a dead tree, you will not have fruit, right? That's not a mystery. That's not a debate. That's just simple creation logic. And if you have a living tree, let's say an apple tree in this instance, apples will inevitably follow, not as a possibility, but as a reality, as an inevitability. The presence of apples does not make the apple tree alive. Rather, it merely reveals that the apple tree is already alive. And that's what James is getting at. James is saying that the idea of a living apple tree that produces no apples is complete nonsense. It's hogwash. And yet this is exactly what Roman Orthodoxy must affirm. They have to say that a person can possess a faith that is genuinely saving in kind, and yet produces no fruit, produces no obedience, no visible transformation, until something else is added to that faith, and then suddenly that faith becomes alive, right? They have to add the apples to the apple tree for the apple tree then to become alive. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't, right? It makes absolutely no sense in the analogy, and it makes absolutely no sense in James's framework. For James, fruit is not something you add later in order to make faith saving. Fruit is the evidence that faith is saving, which means Rome is forced into a dilemma at this point. Either they say that works are evidence of saving faith, and of course, at that point, they have to concede sola fide in substance, even though they reject it in name. Or they say that works are more than evidence. They will have to say that they are a separate category that contributes to justification, that contributes and makes faith saving. And if Rome wants to be consistent with its own system, it has to choose that second option. But you see, the moment that it does so, at that point, they are no longer disagreeing with Protestants, they're disagreeing with James. You see, James only allows for one category, which is a faith that works. It is an apple tree that produces apples. Rome requires two categories. Faith as one thing, works as another thing, both contributing to justification. You have the apple tree and then you have the apples. They're separate and they have to be combined together to make a living apple tree. But James explicitly shuts that down, right? He will not permit a framework where faith exists on its own and works are later added to make it effective, which is why at this point, the Catholic and Orthodox understanding of justification is not just strained by James 2. It is fundamentally incompatible with it, my friends. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there, because there's a third pressure point in James chapter 2 that forces Rome into an even more serious theological corner. And we see it clearly in verses 19 and 20, where James says this: you believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works, it's useless? Now, that's a striking move by James, and it's one that I pointed out briefly in the last video, but we need to just slow down here because the implications are just absolutely enormous. You see, James directly compares the faith of the person who claims that they believe but has no works to vindicate that belief with the faith of demons. And he doesn't do this loosely or rhetorically. Rather, he draws a deliberate one-to-one comparison. The demons believe that God is one. In other words, they have correct doctrine. They affirm monotheism. They affirm who God is, right? They know the truth about God far better than most human beings ever will. And yet James says very plainly that this belief does not save them. In fact, it produces terror in them, not obedience. And so what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the faith James is condemning is not merely insufficient, but rather it is fundamentally disordered. It is not saving faith in an underdeveloped state. It is not dormant faith waiting to be activated by our cooperation. It is a faith that is demonic in nature. Any belief system that says I can affirm correct doctrine while remaining in open rebellion and disobedience to God is not neutral, according to James. James says it mirrors the faith of demons. And this is where the problem for Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy becomes even more severe, in my opinion, because Rome has already committed itself thus far throughout this passage to treating that antinomian faith that James is condemning as potentially salvific in verse 14. They're treating that antinomian faith that James mentions in verse 14 as potentially salvific, right? They must say that that faith James describes is real faith, that it is just inactive, that is just incomplete, that is just waiting for human cooperation to make it alive. But again, James will not allow that category. If the faith James is talking about can be brought to life through human cooperation, then logically speaking, the faith of demons is also potentially salvific, provided that is activated by their obedience. Now, I know Rome and even Orthodoxy would never make that claim or even say that out loud. But that's precisely James's point. The fact that demons cannot be saved by this kind of faith, even potentially, proves that this faith is not saving in kind. Again, James' whole point. James is not saying demons have saving faith that lacks for works. He's saying that demons have belief without submission. And that belief is worthless for salvation, which means that the faith that he is condemning in verse 14 is the exact same kind of faith in view here. It's not saving faith that needs improving. It is a counterfeit faith altogether. And this exposes something even deeper in Rome's system, something that often goes unnoticed. You see, Rome is forced at this point to reduce faith to something merely intellectual, right? Something that is merely a mental assent, right? A cognitive acknowledgement of truth, because that is the only way that it can treat this condemned faith as legitimate in any sense. But Scripture simply does not define faith in that way. Biblically speaking, faith is not merely believing that something is true. It is believing in God. It is trusting. It is allegiance. It is submission, and it's reliance. Yes, faith includes intellectual assent, but it is never limited to it, right? And James assumes that richer and much fuller definition throughout this entire passage, which is why it is absolutely incoherent to him to speak of this saving faith, this much fuller faith that has no works. Rome, however, has to flatten faith into something demons can possess in the exact same way that humans do, and then introduce works as a separate independent category that must be added later to make that faith effective, right? Faith becomes belief. Works becomes obedience, and justification becomes the product of combining the two. But James refuses to operate within those categories, as I keep mentioning over and over again. James does not treat faith as a neutral substance waiting for human activation. He treats faith as either alive or dead. Either it submits or it rebels. Either it produces obedience or it mirrors demonic belief. There is no middle category, my friends. And so, once again, this doesn't require an expert commentary or a technical theologian to see this. James is not speaking in code here, right? He is not using obscure language. He is speaking very plainly and pastorally and directly to us. And his conclusion is absolutely unmistakable. The faith that claims belief while remaining in disobedience is not saving faith. It is demonic in pattern, and it is powerless to save. And once you see that, it becomes increasingly clear that Rome is not merely misreading James at a few points here and there. Rome has to fundamentally reinterpret what faith even is, in order to make its system survive in this chapter. And that alone should raise some serious red flags. But you see, those are not the only red flags raised in this passage, because in verses 21 through 23, James delivers what I believe is really the decisive blow to the Orthodox and Catholic system of justification. You see, in that passage, James says this: "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son Isaac, on the altar?" You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, "Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God." Now, I'm not going to re-argue everything I already laid out in the previous video. Instead, I just want to slow this down and put 3 simple premises in front of us that derive from this passage. And I'll have these 3 premises up on the screen so that you can track along with me. And so the first premise is this: Abraham is declared righteous by God in Genesis chapter 15. Right? The text says that Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now, the word counted there is important for us to key in on, because that's past tense, which means it already happened, which means it's not a process. Rather, it is a completed declaration. That's important. The second premise is that Abraham's offering of Isaac does not occur until Genesis chapter 22, which is many, many years later. And so whatever Genesis 22 is doing, it is doing it after Abraham has already been declared righteous by God. Again, it's not by us, it is by God. And the third premise is that Abraham does not die in Genesis chapter 2. Rather, he continues to live on for many, many years afterward. And so with those 3 premises firmly in place, we can begin to see why this passage is so devastating to the Roman Catholic system of justification. You see, if Rome is correct, then God's declaration in Genesis chapter 15 must be provisional, right? It cannot be a final verdict. It cannot be something that was completed in the past. It must say something like, Abraham is righteous for now, assuming future cooperation. But my friends, that is not what the text says. God doesn't declare Abraham potentially righteous, or temporarily righteous, or righteous pending future obedience. He declares him righteous, full stop. And this immediately creates a problem, because in the Roman Catholic system, justification is not something you could ever say you definitively possess in this life. You are not justified in the Roman Catholic and Orthodoxy system. Rather, you are being justified, right? It is a process that remains open until death. And yet Genesis chapter 15 presents justification as a completed act grounded in faith. And what makes this even more serious is that the scripture does not even record God telling Abraham that, hey, you're going to be saved if you continue cooperating, right? It doesn't say that, right? The narrative simply states the verdict for us to understand, right? God's declaration stands on its own authority, independent of Abraham's future action, right? Rome has to smuggle in a provisional status that simply is not there. Now, I understand that Rome will often appeal to James' language in verse 23, where he says that scripture was fulfilled when Abraham offered Isaac. But even then, if Rome interprets fulfill to mean that God's declaration in Genesis chapter 15 was not actually true until Genesis chapter 22 happened, then the implication, as we will see, is absolutely staggering, right? That would mean that God declared something, right, that he rendered a verdict and presented it as a fact when it was not, in fact, true at the time that he said it. In other words, my friend, to make this very, very clear what this will mean, it will mean that God is a liar. But God, 1, is not a liar, and 2, God did not say Abraham will be counted righteous if he later obeys. He said Abraham believed, and it was counted to him as righteous right then and there. Right? James himself treats that declaration as genuine, as settled, and as authoritative, right? That's not in question for James, right? Genesis chapter 22 does not correct Genesis chapter 15. Rather, it publicly vindicates it. The word vindicates means shown to be real, right? And this problem only gets worse when we consider the third premise, which is the fact that Abraham does not die in just chapter 22. In the Roman Catholic framework, final justification is not secured until death, because at any point, a person could commit mortal sin and fall out of a state of grace, which means Abraham's righteous status, according to Rome, would still be hanging in the balance after Genesis chapter 22. But James nor God treats Abraham that way at all, right? James does not say Abraham entered a higher stage of justification. He does not say Abraham became righteous at the altar. He says Abraham's faith was shown to be real. It was vindicated. It was demonstrated. It was made visible. Just as apples make it visible that an apple tree is alive. The apples don't make the apple tree alive. The apples vindicate, and it shows that the apple tree is alive. And so, similarly, Abraham's obedience does not create the verdict. It confirms it. And just in case anyone thinks James is doing some special pleading here, right? Just carving out an exception for Abraham specifically, James immediately removes that escape route by bringing up Rahab in verse 25, who is a Gentile and a prostitute, right? Someone with no patriarchal pedigree whatsoever. And yet the exact same pattern applies, my friends. It is faith first. Her works are vindicated later, and then obedience follows as evidence, right? And so what James gives us is not a justification process, but a justification pattern. God declares sinners righteous by faith. And that faith, because it is alive and active, expresses itself in obedience over time, right? And this is not limited to Abraham. It actually equally applies to Rahab as well. It applies to Jews and to Gentiles, to the patriarchs and to prostitute. And once you see that, my friends, Rome has absolutely nowhere left to run. James leaves no room for a cooperative system where justification is initiated by faith or is maintained by works and finalized by death. The chronology of Abraham simply will not allow that reading. The grammar will not allow it. And the example James chooses explicitly rule it out. Justification is a verdict, not a process. And works do not create that verdict, they vindicate it. And so now that we come to the fifth and final pain point in James chapter 2, and this is where everything really comes to a head, right? This is the works animating faith problem that shows up most clearly in verses 24 and 26, where James says this: you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Now, I just want to acknowledge something right up front. On the surface, these verses can absolutely sound like James is saying that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And I understand why many people walk away from that passage thinking that James is at least giving a gentle nod toward the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox view of justification, which is the fact that justification is faith plus works, or in their preferred language, faith plus human cooperation. But this is exactly where we have to slow down and remember literally everything that we've walked through in this passage. James has not suddenly changed subjects. He has not reversed course, and he has not contradicted the framework he himself established back in verse 14 and 18 and 21 to 23. From the very beginning, James has been addressing a specific problem. A person claiming to have saving faith simply because they say that they have saving faith. In verses 15 to 17, James exposes the absurdity of that claim by using the illustration of empty words. Give an example of someone telling someone else to be warmed and filled without actually giving them food and clothing to be warmed and filled. And the point there that he's making is absolutely obvious. How do I actually know that you mean what you say? The only way that I know you are being serious when you tell me to be warmed and filled is if, when the opportunity exists and you have the means to act, you actually act. And that same logic carries all the way through verses 24 and 26. Faith, again, by its very nature, is invisible. You cannot see faith directly. You cannot point to it. So a claim to faith is not self-authenticating. Saying I have faith does not prove that you have faith, any more than saying I care about the poor proves that you actually care about the poor. The only way invisible realities are known is when they manifest themselves visibly. And that's exactly what James has been arguing from start to finish. And so when James says in verse 24 that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, he's not saying that works create saving faith or completes saving faith. He is saying that faith is not justified, meaning vindicated or shown to be real, by mere profession alone. A claim to saving faith is justified only when that faith is actually shown to be alive. And James seals that argument with this final analogy in verse 26, where he says, for as the body apart from works from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Now, this is where things usually go off the rails, in my opinion, because many people instinctively assume a rigid one-to-one mapping, right? Faith equals the body, and then works equals the spirit. And so if you accept that mapping, then works become the animating principle of faith. That's what you would be saying. Works would be what give faith life. And I know exactly why Rome would want that to be the case, because their system depends on the idea that a dead faith or a dormant faith can be activated and brought to life by human cooperation. But that reading completely collapses the analogy. You see, my friends, analogies do not work by surface level symmetry. They work by function. And functionally, the spirit is the life-giving principle in this analogy. The body is the visible expression of that life. A body does not give life to the spirit. A spirit gives life to a body. And so when a body is dead, it is not waiting to be reanimated later. It is dead, full stop. That is James' whole entire point. When Lazarus was dead, his body sat there lifeless until Jesus gave the spirit back to Lazarus' body, and then he was raised from the dead. Right? His spirit returned to him. The spirit is the thing that animates the body. We already know this. And so faith is either alive or is dead. It does not exist in a dormant, morally neutral state, waiting for works to switch it on. Works are not the spirit in this analogy. They are the body, right? They are the visible movement that proves that life is present, right? And so if there is no movement, of course, where opportunity exists, there is no life to explain. And so once you see that, the Roman Catholic reading really becomes impossible to sustain. Because if works truly animate faith, then Abraham's faith, by definition, would have been dead until Genesis chapter 22. It would have been non-saving, right? And that would make God's declaration in Genesis chapter 15 false when it was spoken. Right? If works animate faith, then the thief on the cross could not have been saved, because James says, can that faith save him? Right? Faith without works being dead. Can that faith save him? Well, the thief on the cross probably couldn't have been saved because he had no opportunity to perform works. Because again, in that analogy, works is animating faith, right? And so if works animates faith, then justification would inevitably become a boast-worthy type of situation, because someone could rightly say, I did what another did not. I animated my faith. It is I that did this, or it is I that did that. But James allows none of that. He does not teach a faith that is kept alive by works. He teaches a living faith that expresses itself through works, right? Just like an apple tree shows that it is alive and well by producing apples. And so if you remove works, or if you remove apples, faith, like the apple tree, becomes invisible Just like if you remove the body, the spirit becomes invisible. But that invisibility reveals something deeper, which is the absence of life itself. And so when James ends this passage, he does not leave us with ambiguity. He leaves us with clarity. Faith alone saves, but the faith that saves is alive, and it is not alone, right? And so because it is alive, it moves, it acts, it obeys. Works, my friends, do not animate faith. Instead, they reveal whether faith was ever alive in the first place. And to insist otherwise would be to introduce a works-based salvation. And this is why, as Protestants, we do say Rome and Orthodoxy have a works-based salvation. And so what are we meant to take away from all this? Well, the answer, I think, is both obvious and unavoidable. James chapter 2 does not support Roman Catholicism and, by extension, Eastern Orthodoxy in the slightest. In fact, when James is allowed to speak on his own term, this passage does not merely fail to prop up those systems, it actively undermines them. And to be completely honest, it does more than undermine them. It exposes them as absolutely heretical. I'm sorry to say that, but I'm also not sorry because I'm standing on the gospel. It's heresy, right? What Rome and Orthodoxy are attempting to import into James is a fundamentally different gospel. It is a system where faith is treated as something inert, as something merely intellectual, as something that only becomes salvific once it is animated by human cooperation. In other words, it is a works-animated faith. And James has no category for that. None. The faith that James condemns is not insufficient. It is dead, right? It is not immature. It is empty. And it is not morally neutral. It is demonic in nature. That is James' language, not mine. And what makes it worse is that Rome and Orthodoxy is forced, if it wants to remain consistent, to treat that demonic faith as real and even potentially salvific. All it needs, they say, is activation by our human cooperation. It just needs more obedience. It just needs more cooperation. It needs more effort. But that is not the gospel, my friends. That is not good news. That is the worst possible news that you could ever receive, because it places salvation on a long, exhausting treadmill where assurance is impossible and the verdict is always pending. You are never truly declared righteous in the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodoxy system. That status is only in process, only provisional, only hoping you have done enough when you finally breathe your last breath. But my friends, that is not Christianity. That is not distinct from Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism or any other ism built on human contribution. It is a different religion entirely. And when I say this is heresy, I do not mean this is merely a serious error or an unfortunate misunderstanding. No. I'm not mincing my words here. I mean it is fundamentally a different gospel. And a different gospel, as James rightly says, does not save. James is clear. Saving faith is not created by works. It is revealed by them. It is not sustained by human effort. It produces obedience because it is life. And where that life is absent, no amount of human cooperation can manufacture it. You cannot resurrect dead faith by trying harder. You either have living faith or you do not. And so if you're a Protestant watching this, I want to encourage you to share this. Share it with your Catholic friends, your Orthodox friends, your family members, even strangers. James chapter 2 is often treated as a place of safety and validation for these systems, but it is not. And it is time that we stop acting like it is. We do not need Paul to explain James. We do not need John to explain James. We do not need to run elsewhere in Scripture to make James's point absolutely clear. All we need to do is let James say what James has already said. And all we need to do is stress test other people's interpretations to push them to its logical conclusions. That's all I did here. And so if you are Catholic or Orthodox and you happen to be watching this, my message to you is very simple. Repent and believe. Stop trusting in a barren gospel that cannot save you. You cannot do enough. You never have, and you never will. Right? If you have saving faith, it will show itself. And if you do not, your life will reflect that reality as well. And that is not my verdict, my friends. That is James. And guess what? And this is my challenge to each and every person who listens to this. If you want me to debate this topic with anyone and everyone, I will accept that challenge. That's how confident I am in this, right? And if you want to leave a comment in the comment section, please, by all means, right? Show me where I'm wrong. Don't give me this whole, oh, are you saying all these other people are wrong? Are you saying this? I don't care about all that, right? If James says that you're wrong because you hold to this, and there's like thousands of people that hold to this view, guess what? They're wrong. The beauty of the gospel is that I don't need to take comfort in like, oh, well, I'm going to base my salvation on just what everybody else is over here saying in this other group. I don't care. I don't care. I'm calling them to repent and believe too. And so, look, engage in the comment section. Challenge me to a debate. I accept it, right? Because the gospel needs defending. But all right, guys, that's the video. I know this was a long one, and I genuinely appreciate everyone who stuck with me to the end. If you found this helpful, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really does help that channel out a lot, especially with a video like this, because I know it's not going to get a lot of likes and stuff like that because it's a little confrontational, but it's true. But anyways, until next time, guys, peace.